Our scripture lesson this morning comes from the last chapter of the Gospel of Luke. That's the 24th chapter, starting at the 13th verse and going a long way. Now, this is a story after Jesus has died, and angels have told the women that Jesus has risen again, and they go back and tell the rest of the people, and nobody believes them. And this is what happens next. Now, on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women in our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them all the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking with us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is a special Sunday for me because I got to choose whatever I wanted to preach on, and this is one of my very favorite stories, so this is what you're getting today. It's especially my favorite story of Jesus' resurrection. I have often preached on it on the Sunday after Easter, and on that time we concentrate on the joyous news of Jesus' resurrection. A week after Easter, of course, that emphasis is on the resurrection, but this morning I remember that for Jesus' friends and followers, first there was grief and pain because Jesus was dead, and not just dead, but dead too soon. And more than that, he was killed, and not just killed, but executed unfairly. They couldn't help thinking that it just shouldn't have been ending that way. That's where people who loved and followed Jesus were, starting emotionally at this time. I know many of you have been in that space, maybe more than once. I remember the largest funeral I ever conducted for Patty Burchett, who was a central member of this congregation and this community, and who died a long, painful death from cancer. Her family and all those whose lives she touched had to let go of hopes and plans and expectations. She died too soon. It felt so unfair. It's not easy to transfer from our grief to hoping in Jesus Christ and the future he promises that he brings. It never has been. It wasn't easy or automatic for those two travelers on the road to Emmaus, and it usually isn't easy for you or me. Two families recently touched by death were in my mind as I began to dig into what this scripture passage might mean for this congregation this particular Sunday. A month ago, we had a memorial service at that other Westminster, my home church, Westminster Olympia. It was for a tiny baby. A couple had tried and tried and tried to have a baby. And finally, they were joyfully looking forward to a second child, a little girl, to be a sister to their son. All was going fine until it wasn't. The parents realized that the fetus was not growing normally, and they had to make the unbearable but the only compassionate choice to terminate that pregnancy. Your pastor, Robin, conducted a service of remembrance for the grieving family, and he stressed the truth that God does not measure a soul's value by the length of one's life. He spoke of grief and hope and the call to trust in God, in the reality of the resurrection. And that same week, my daughter called to vent about a funeral she and my young granddaughter had just attended for a 7th grade boy who had been fighting cancer for about a year. His cancer medication killed the cancer, but it also killed him. It was not supposed to work like that. So many people at that funeral were full of anger at the unfairness of that death. Where was God in all of that? And my daughter said it didn't help that the pastor talked about God wanting another little angel up in heaven. Was that God's purpose? Surely doesn't God give life to God's children only to abandon them to suffer and die? Such deaths are awful, but we are called to remember that death is not the end of the story by God's grace. I believe that. I believe that the resurrection of Jesus Christ seals that promise to each of us. But the two people walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus were not so sure. Surely God doesn't abandon us in our feelings. It was a mixture of feelings that they had as they came back to Jerusalem to celebrate. They came back to Jerusalem. They had been there to celebrate the Passover, the Independence Day of the Jewish calendar, but they were not part of an independent people. Roman soldiers were everywhere. Roman law hung over their heads. Cleopas and his companion, I've always believed it was Mrs. Cleopas, were following this new teacher, Jesus. Maybe they had seen him perform miracles of healing. Surely they had heard about such wonderful but impossible things. Probably they'd heard him teach. The important thing was Jesus understood their lives, their problems. He spoke what they needed to hear about love, forgiveness, peace, and justice. Could he be the one to bring about a new day for them, for their people? But no, it didn't happen like that. The powers that be killed Jesus, and he was executed like any common criminal, even though he'd done nothing wrong. People they knew and trusted reported seeing him die. When Jesus was executed, when he died on that cross, it seemed that hope died too. His followers were in despair. Add that to the very real fear that everyone connected with Jesus might be in danger from the authorities too. The safest thing was to head home fast. Then, as they were getting ready to travel, in rushed some women who had gone to Jesus' tomb. They said, "Angels said Jesus was not dead." These angels reminded the women that Jesus told them events would happen just the way they did. I think Cleopas and his companion were there when the women told this exciting news. I believe they were there when calmer heads, people who had been closer to Jesus, didn't believe the women. Who should they believe? Who to trust? The safest way was just to be sensible. So the two travelers decided to head home as planned. It might take them half a day to walk that 7 miles. There would be plenty of time to talk over what might be or might not have happened. Probably better not to get your hopes up. After all, life is so often unfair and God's ways are mysterious. I suppose there were quite a few people walking on the road that day. Lots of people they didn't know. But one particular stranger was interested in their discussion. Was it possible he didn't even know about Jesus of Nazareth? Didn't know about the commotion he caused and the death he died? That was a story nobody could keep to themselves. That was a story that led to all kinds of questions unanswered. If Jesus was sent by God, why had God not protected this good man? Why crush our hopes again and again? I imagine they had many of the same questions you and I have taken when death comes too soon and very unfairly. But this stranger was Jesus. We know that, but the true travelers just knew he had answers to their concerns. The stranger went through the scriptures with them to show that the prophets knew the Messiah would have to suffer and die. He explained that this had to happen before he entered into his glory. What could that mean? While they were pondering that puzzle, they came to their hometown and invited the stranger to have supper with them. Now remember, they'd been gone from home for several days. There were no refrigerators, no Safeway around the corner. Putting any sort of meal on the table would take some effort and ingenuity. That's why I think there was a Mrs. Cleopas. Bread was baked and shared and broken together, and Jesus was known to them in the breaking of bread. Jesus, who had been the guest, was suddenly the host. He gave the blessing they knew so well. He said over and over, when he shared with them over and over as he said, "Blessed are you, Lord, ruler of the universe, who brings forth grain from the earth." Then, before he finished the prayer, he tore a piece of flatbread, and the gospel says, was known to them in the breaking of the bread. Suddenly they recognized it was Jesus, sitting in their home, sharing food and conversation and hope. Then he was gone, disappeared. But that would be enough. They had spent time with the risen Christ. They couldn't keep the news to themselves. They had to tell what they had experienced. So that same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, is what it said in verse 33. In times of effort and times of distance, that's like deciding after a long day and a short meal to drive from here to Seattle, just to tell their friends, Jesus' friends, about this life-changing event. That's all we know about Cleopas and his companion. We never even hear about the town named Emmaus again. But that day, that Easter day, changed their lives. Ask yourself how it would change you if you invited a stranger to a meal on a whim and it turned out to be Jesus. That sounds far-fetched maybe, but I would guess you've heard sermons about recognizing Jesus in your neighbor, especially people in need. I'd like to think that those two not very important people were so filled with radical hospitality after that it made a difference in their small corner of the world. Or they were so full of joy that they had to spread the news about Jesus' brief time with them. Generosity of what they had to give of food or gospel makes them our spiritual ancestors. There's a direct line between the Passover meal Jesus ate with his followers when he broke bread and shared it with his followers to this very basic meal, maybe just bread, that these two people from a tiny village shared with a stranger who, even though they didn't know it, was their risen Lord. To the communion meal we will share this hour. Christian theologians have spent lifetimes and buckets of ink explaining or trying to explain the central reality of our faith. For this morning, I want to suggest one small corner of this huge reality. Jesus, who is both completely God and completely human, is present with us in every kind of experience, good or bad, any of us can possibly face. He lived among us, died for us, rose in power, and is with us today and always. He knows about all our highs and lows, our fears and hopes, and he wants us to know deep down that we are not alone. He walks with us to make sure we know death is only half the story. This morning, once again, I will proclaim the saving death of our risen Lord until he comes again. It's the first Sunday of the month, Communion Sunday. It's good to share this sacred meal together. I invite all of us, each in our own way, to make sure this ritual is a celebration, not a habit, a calling, not an obligation. Here is how the Iona community in Ireland puts this invitation for renewal. He was always the guest. In the homes of Peter, Martha, and Mary, he was always the guest. At the meal tables of the wealthy, where he pled the case of the poor, he was always the guest. Upsetting polite company, befriending isolated people, welcoming the stranger, he was always the guest. Even at Emmaus, he was the guest. But here, at this table, he is the host. Those who wish to serve him must first be served by him. Those who want to follow him must first be fed by him. For this is the table where God intends us to be nourished. This is the time when Christ can make us new. So come, all who hunger and thirst for a deeper life, faith, for a better life, for a fairer world. Jesus, who has sat at our tables, now invites us to be guests at him. Now let's stand and sing our commitment.